Ransom slumped against the cabin wall, his body a gaunt shadow of its former self. The once sturdy frame of a hard-working man had become skeletal from days without food. His clothes, now hanging loosely, had seen better days. His face was hollow, eyes sunken, dark rings marking the toll the past few days had taken. In his arms, his daughter, Fiza, lay still, her small body burning with fever. Her breathing was labored, each rasping breath sounding more desperate than the last. Her skin had gone pale, and her lips were cracked, the heat of her fever more than he could handle. He glanced around the cabin. Empty cupboards, bare shelves, and the last candle burning low, casting flickering shadows across the dirt floor. The silence of the place was overwhelming. Only the sound of Fiza's labored breaths filled the space, a constant reminder of how close to death they both were. His rifle lay beside him, the weight of it both a burden and a final hope. There was only one bullet left. His fingers hovered over the cold steel of the rifle, trembling. Mercy or hope? He wondered. Mercy to end Fiza's suffering, or hope that somehow someone might arrive to save her? The guilt weighed heavy on him. He had promised Sarah, his late wife, that he would keep their daughter safe. But now, in this barren place, with no food, no help, and no answers, he could barely keep his own promise. His breath hitched as he turned the rifle toward his daughter, ready to end it all, ready to silence the pain that gripped them both. Then, in the distance, the sound of horse hooves reached his ears. Slow, deliberate. A faint hope flickered inside him, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. No one came out here, not for years. His hand shook as he raised the rifle, weakly aiming toward the sound. But he couldn't bring himself to shoot. He watched, heart pounding, as a figure emerged from the dust, silhouetted against the pale sky. A woman. Her face was weathered, her clothes worn and dusty, and heavy saddlebags hung from her horse. She approached slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, everything else faded. "I have bread," she called out, her voice carrying a quiet strength, "and herbs that might save her." Ransom blinked, disbelieving. Could it be real? Could someone, anyone, have found them? He didn't lower the rifle. He couldn't trust this stranger. "Why would you help us?" he rasped, his voice rough from days without a drink. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her hands, palms out, showing him there was no threat. "Because I can't hear your daughter dying from here." Her eyes locked with his, steady and calm. "Everyone wants something," she added softly. Ransom's mind reeled. He couldn't think straight. This woman had no reason to help. There was no reason for anyone to risk their life coming out here. But then she said the words that broke through his doubt. "I want her to live. That's all." Fiza's weak whimper came from inside the cabin. Unia's eyes flicked toward the sound, and without waiting for an answer, she spoke again. "You can shoot me after if you want, but let me try first." Ransom's finger twitched on the trigger, but the rifle slowly lowered. Not out of trust, but because there was no choice left. He was out of options. The woman, whoever she was his last hope. And if she couldn't save Fiza, there would be no one left to blame but himself. She entered the cabin with quiet purpose, her movements practiced. She set her saddlebags down and began to assess the situation without a word. "Lung fever," she said after a moment, her voice steady. 3 days gone, but not lost. Not yet. Ransom watched, his breath catching as she opened her medicine bag, pulling out dried herbs, tinctures, and roots. She moved with confidence, a strange calmness settling over the room. She built a fire and heated water, making poultices, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Hold her head. Gently. Like this," she commanded, showing him how to support Fiza's fragile neck. Ransom obeyed, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them under his daughter's head. The small act of caring felt alien to him, like he had forgotten how to touch her with gentleness. But as the woman, this stranger, continued to work, He found himself following her instructions with a sense of urgency. She had a purpose, and in her presence, for the first time in days, Ransom found himself hoping. She made him drink willow bark tea, telling him, "You're worthless to her dead." And then, breaking a loaf of bread, she gave him the larger piece, urging him to eat. "I need you strong enough to follow my instructions." He ate slowly, his throat tight with gratitude and grief. Tears slipped down his face as he chewed, but they weren't from hunger. They were from the small kindness this woman showed, a kindness that had felt like a lifetime since he'd last known it. Hours passed in a blur of herbs, poultices, and prayers. Fiza's fever raged, but Unia never stopped. Every time her condition seemed to worsen, Unia remained calm, steady, focused on the task at hand. Ransom didn't sleep. He couldn't, not while his daughter was still hanging between life and death. He watched this woman, this healer, save his daughter in ways he couldn't understand. Each hour, he felt a small piece of the weight lift from his chest. But at midnight, Fiza's breathing became labored once again, more shallow, more strained. Unia's hands moved quickly, her voice never rising above a whisper as she commanded Ransom to sit Fiza up. They worked together, Ransom holding his daughter steady, Unia knowing exactly what to do. With one final, violent cough, Fiza expelled fluid from her lungs, her body finally easing from the fever. "She's turned the corner," Unia whispered, her voice thick with relief. Ransom collapsed, silent tears falling as he let himself believe. For the first time in days, the weight of despair seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile hope. "I thought I'd lost her," he whispered, his voice breaking. Unia paused, her eyes soft. "You still might. Next 3 days are critical." She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "Will you stay?" There was a long silence before he answered, his voice low, but filled with conviction. "Yes." And as the first light of dawn broke through the window, Fiza's breathing became steady, peaceful. She had survived the night. But would she wake? The story had just begun. The first night passed in a blur of fevered sweat and healing hands, but it was not without its struggles. Ransom sat on the floor beside Fiza, watching as Unia worked tirelessly. She was a stranger, yet her presence felt almost like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope that was fading with every passing hour. He couldn't understand how she could be so calm, so focused. He had nothing left but the rifle, and now that it was lowered, he felt vulnerable, exposed. He watched her, still suspicious, still afraid that this kindness would come with a price. When Unia stepped out of the cabin to gather more herbs, he didn't lower his guard. His grip tightened around the rifle, even though the immediate threat had passed. His mind raced with thoughts. Why would she help them? What did she want in return? His fingers itched on the trigger, but he wasn't sure if it was fear or frustration that made him want to pull it. He had never been a man to rely on others, but now he was helpless, watching as a stranger fought for his daughter's life. When Unia returned, Ransom didn't speak at first. His gaze hardened, and he asked quietly, "Why would you help us?" The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but he had to know. She didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes met his unwavering. "Because I can't hear your daughter dying from here," she said simply. There was no anger in her tone, no resentment, just a quiet urgency. She moved toward Fiza with practiced ease, her hands working quickly to tend to the fever. And for the first time in days, Ransom felt a small seed of hope bloom. Still, he couldn't shake the fear that it might all be too late. "Everyone wants something," he muttered. "I want her to live," Unia replied, her voice soft, but with a quiet strength that made his heart stutter. He couldn't argue with that. But the rifle still lay beside him, the one bullet a reminder of how quickly everything could end. He lowered it, reluctantly, as she took charge. There was no trust in his actions, just exhaustion and the realization that he was out of options. As Unia worked, Ransom watched her, a strange mix of gratitude and doubt running through him. She moved with a confidence he could never match, using herbs and poultices to calm Fee's fever. She directed him to hold his daughter's head, her hands gentle but firm as she guided him through each step. "Hold her like this," she instructed, and though Ransom followed without question, he couldn't help but wonder who this woman was and why she was doing this. She had a quiet authority that spoke volumes. When Fee's fever spiked again, Unia didn't flinch, but told him to fetch more hot water, her voice sharp but never harsh. He moved, numb, trying to keep up with her pace, his body aching from the lack of food and sleep. She was giving orders like she had done this 1,000 times before, and he obeyed without question. The night stretched on, and time seemed to lose meaning as the two of them worked side by side, each aware that their only goal was survival. The only sound in the cabin were the crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of Unia's instructions, and the ragged breath of his daughter. Ransom felt as though he were moving through a dream, too tired to think, too scared to let himself hope. At some point, he stopped questioning her, stopped doubting. He simply watched, helpless, as she fought to save Fiza. But even as the hours wore on, the fear never left him. Fiza's breathing became more strained, more desperate, and Unia worked frantically but without panic. She was always calm, always measured, even when things seemed to be spiraling out of control. Ransom could only watch, feeling like an outsider in his own life. When Fiza began to cough violently, he felt his heart stop. He knew this was the moment. It was either life or death, and there was nothing he could do to change it. But Unia didn't hesitate. She sat Fiza up, her hands quick and sure as she positioned the girl's body in a way that seemed impossible to Ransom. "Hold her steady," she told him, and though his arms were trembling from exhaustion, he did as she asked. Together, they worked to clear the fluid from Fiza's lungs, his strength and her knowledge working in tandem. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Fiza's breathing slowed, became easier. Unia exhaled in relief, but her face was still set in determination. "She's turned the corner," she whispered. Ransom could hardly believe it. He looked down at his daughter, her fever finally beginning to break, her breathing no longer ragged. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tears of relief filled his eyes, and for the first time in days, he let them fall. He had thought he'd lost her. He had been ready to give up, to end her suffering. But now, thanks to the stranger, his little girl was still alive. He choked back a sob, swallowing down the overwhelming sense of gratitude that surged through him. "I thought I'd lost her," he said, his voice thick. Unia didn't answer immediately. She simply took a deep breath and met his gaze. "You still might," she said softly, "but the next 3 days are critical." Ransom nodded, his mind racing. "Will you stay?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Unia didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for Ransom. The silence that followed fell heavy, but there was a small, fragile hope growing between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. The night stretched on, and Ransom's exhaustion was finally beginning to catch up with him. He had no idea what the future would hold, but for now, Fiza was alive, and that was enough. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the cabin's walls, casting soft, golden beams across the room where Ransom sat at Fiza's side. Her fever had broken during the night, and now she slept naturally, her breaths even and steady. Unia, exhausted but still focused, sat slumped in the chair beside them, her eyes closed, the weariness in her body evident, though she refused to rest long. Ransom couldn't tear his eyes away from Fiza. His little girl was still with him, still alive. The overwhelming relief felt like a weight he hadn't known he'd been carrying. He glanced at Unia, wondering how she could have known what to do, how she could have brought his daughter back from the brink of death. As he sat there, thoughts swirled in his mind, not just about the struggle they'd been through, but about the woman who had saved Fiza. The first thing he tried to do was make coffee, but his hands were too shaky, and the result was a bitter, burnt mess that even he couldn't drink. Unia awoke to the smell, wrinkling her nose as she sat up, looking over at him with a weak smile. "You ever made coffee before?" she asked, her voice hoarse but light. "My wife handled that," Ransom replied quietly, his gaze falling to the floor. Unia didn't respond at first, but then her eyes softened in understanding. They both felt the absence of Sarah in the space between them, her death still raw, even after all these years. Fiza's voice broke through the quiet, weak but filled with the innocence only a child could possess. "Daddy," she asked, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. The relief that surged through Ransom's chest was almost unbearable, and his lips trembled as he whispered, "Sweetheart, you're awake." She blinked at him as if still half in a fever dream, and then her gaze shifted to Unia. "Who's the pretty lady?" Fiza asked, her voice small but curious. The innocence in her tone took Unia by surprise, and she couldn't help but chuckle softly. "That's Unia," Ransom replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved your life, little bird." Fiza's eyes widened, as if trying to comprehend the enormity of it. "She's like a healer?" she asked, the words awkward on her tongue. Unia smiled at the child, a warmth filling her chest that she hadn't realized she needed. "Yes," she said gently. "I'm a healer, just like Ruth was." "Like Ruth," Fiza said brightly. "But I'm going to be one too, right?" Unia's heart swelled as she looked down at the little girl. "You can be anything you want, little bird," she replied, her voice soft, almost wistful. Ransom watched the two of them, an unexpected tenderness building in his chest. The bond between Unia and Fiza had already started to form, and he could see it in the way Fiza trusted her so completely. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he had missed seeing his daughter smile, seeing her so full of life and curiosity. Over the next few hours, the room filled with the sounds of simple activities. Unia teaching him how to prepare the healing broth for Fiza, showing him how to monitor her temperature, how to administer the herb she had brought. Ransom was a quick learner, though clumsy at times. He had never been one for gentle care. He had always been the strong, silent type, accustomed to labor and survival. But now, with Fiza recovering, he found himself learning, listening, and following Unia's instructions. She was patient with him, and even though her demeanor remained professional, he could see something softer in her eyes when she looked at Fiza. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the way she treated Fiza as if she were her own child, or maybe it was the quiet empathy that shone through whenever Fiza needed comforting. He caught himself watching Unia more than he should, his heart inexplicably drawn to her, to the way she fit into this fragile new life they were trying to build. When Fiza finally started asking about the horse, Unia's face softened. "What's his name?" Fiza asked, a shy grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. Unia paused, realizing she hadn't even thought about naming the horse. "Just horse," she said, shrugging. Fiza giggled, the sound like music to Ransom's ears. "That's silly," she said, her voice full of delight. "We have to name him. I know. Copper. Because his fur is like a shiny penny." Ransom laughed, surprised at the ease with which they were all beginning to feel like a family, even in these early days. "Copper it is," he said, smiling at his daughter's energy. It felt like a small victory, this moment of joy in the midst of their struggle. As the day passed, they settled into an odd sort of rhythm. Unia helped Ransom with the tasks that had fallen behind, repairing the broken fence, tending the small garden that hadn't died from the drought, and mending what little tack they had left. Ransom, in turn, showed her how to care for Copper, how to make the most of what little they had. Fiza, ever the eager helper, tried her best to pitch in, bringing eggs from the chickens and gathering firewood, though her small hands weren't always as helpful as she thought. There was laughter, too, in the simplicity of their work, the three of them working side by side in this fragile, tentative hope. But as the day wore on, Ransom found himself looking at Unia more than he should. There was something about the way she mothered Fiza, how she treated her with such care, such tenderness. He hadn't realized until then how much he had missed seeing that kind of love. It hit him all at once, as if a dam had broken inside him. He had seen Sarah do this. He had seen Sarah pour her heart into raising their daughter, and now Unia was doing the same. He felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. As evening fell and Fiza insisted on having a bedtime story from Unia, Ransom sat in the doorway, watching the two of them. Unia told the story of a brave girl who grew a healing garden, a story of strength and hope. Fiza listened with wide eyes, captivated by every word. "Like you," Fiza exclaimed at the end. Unia smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she looked at Ransom. "Like you'll be," she said softly. It was in that moment, as the cabin was filled with the soft glow of the dying fire and the fading light of the day, that Ransom realized something. He had lost so much: his wife, his home, his hope. But now, in this small cabin, with Fiza's laughter and Unia's quiet strength, he had something worth fighting for again. He didn't know what the future held, or how long they would be safe, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe in a future. And in that belief, something stirred inside him, something that was beginning to feel like hope. But the world outside was not yet done with them. As the night drew in and Fiza fell asleep, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly sound. The past had come knocking. The knock on the door shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the cabin. Ransom's heart skipped a beat as he looked up, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that lay by his side. Unia, too, stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the heavy sound of horses outside, the rhythmic thuds of hooves unmistakable. The moment was too familiar. It reminded her of the day she fled, the day she had escaped Dr. Hollins and his men, the day she had left behind a life of fear. She could hear his voice in her memory, the man who claimed her as his own, who demanded she belong to him. It was not the law he had used, but the power he held over her, and Unia's breath quickened as she braced herself for what was to come. Ransom didn't move, though his mind raced, quickly calculating the odds. They were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let them take Unia. Not after everything she had done for them. Not after everything she had given. He stepped toward the door, his hands still gripping the rifle, his thoughts tangled between the fierce desire to protect and the reality of their situation. When he swung the door open, his eyes fell on the three riders outside. Dr. Hollins, tall and imposing, sat astride his horse, his face twisted in a smug, self-assured smile. Behind him were two hired men, both armed and ready, their eyes scanning the small cabin. They weren't here for pleasantries. "There you are, Unia," Dr. Hollins said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We've been worried sick about you." The words made Unia's stomach churn, and her pulse quickened. She could feel the heat of his gaze, a look she had seen many times before, one that had made her skin crawl. She straightened, trying to keep her composure, but she couldn't hide the anger that flared inside her. "You're trespassing," she said coolly, her voice steady but firm. Holland's smile never faltered. "Trespassing? Hardly. This is my property, Unia. Ruth's things. She left them to me, after all." Unia's stomach churned. He was lying, of course. Ruth had left nothing to him. But he was trying to claim it, just as he had tried to claim her. He was playing his game, and she was no longer willing to play along. "Without a will, Ruth's belongings belong to me," Hollins continued, his tone growing more insistent. Unia's eyes narrowed. "Without a will," she replied, her voice tight. "That's not how it works." Ransom stepped forward, his boots creaking as he crossed the threshold of the cabin. He stood tall, his posture defensive, but his eyes never wavered from Hollins. "She saved my daughter's life with those medicines," Ransom said, his voice low but filled with steel. "You'll have to kill me before you take anything from her." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Hollins didn't blink. His eyes flicked to the rifle that Ransom still held loosely in his hands, and he smirked. "So, that's how it's going to be, huh?" he said, his tone laced with mockery. "You die for a woman you've known only 3 days?" Ransom's grip tightened on the rifle, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. But Unia stepped forward, her voice sharp and calm. "I'll go with you," she said, her eyes meeting Hollins. "But leave them alone. They've done nothing wrong." Ransom looked at her, his eyes widening with disbelief. He could see the resolve in her expression, the quiet strength she always carried with her. But he wouldn't let her make this sacrifice, not when she had already given so much. "No," Ransom said, his voice hard. "You're not going anywhere." Fiza, who had been watching from inside the cabin, suddenly spoke. Her voice was small but clear. "Don't take the pretty lady," she cried, her face pressed against the window as she clutched the glass. Ransom's heart clenched at the sound of her words. She didn't understand the danger, but he did. He could see it now. The man who had terrorized Unia was standing right in front of him, willing to take her away from them. But Ransom wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let fear rule his life any longer. Hollins laughed, a low, derisive sound. "You're going to stand in my way?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. "You're a fool." Ransom raised the rifle, his movements slow but deliberate. "You want her? You go through me," he said, his voice unwavering. Hollins' eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You're willing to die for a woman you barely know?" he sneered. "That's brave but foolish." Ransom didn't flinch. He knew what he was willing to die for. He had nothing left to lose except Fiza, except the life they were slowly building. "I'll die beside someone good before I stand with someone like you," he said firmly, his heart racing, the rifle still aimed at Hollins. The standoff between the three men was thick with tension. The air hung heavy with the knowledge that one wrong move could change everything. Unia's eyes flicked between Ransom and Hollins, her heart in her throat. She had thought this would come to a head sooner or later, but she hadn't expected to feel this terror for someone else. She had thought she was the one who needed saving, but in this moment, it was Ransom who was standing between her and the life she had once run from. Hollins' hand hovered near his own weapon, but he didn't make a move. He was calculating, weighing the risks. Ransom's grip on the rifle tightened. One bullet, one chance. It was a game of life and death, but it wasn't about survival anymore. It was about choosing who you would stand for and who you would stand against. And in that moment, Ransom knew exactly what he would choose. He would choose to protect the family he had found, to protect the woman who had saved his daughter, to protect the future they were building together. Hollins' voice broke the silence. "This isn't finished," he spat. "I'll return with the law. The law's 2 days' ride." Ransom said, his voice steady. "Come back with him if you want, but she stays until then." Hollins sneered, his face twisted in fury. But without another word, he turned his horse and rode off, his men following in his wake. The dust settled, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Ransom lowered the rifle slowly, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He had made a stand, and for now, they were safe. But he knew the danger wasn't over. He looked at Unia, his heart still racing. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice shaking. "He'll come back, with more men. He'll take everything." Ransom met her gaze, his expression softening. "Maybe, but today he didn't take you." The words hung between them, a promise made in the face of fear. Unia's eyes filled with unshed tears as she looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and fear in her gaze. She had been running for so long, but now, standing in this cabin with Ransom, something was changing. Maybe it was the promise of safety. Maybe it was the unexpected bond that had formed between them. Either way, She knew that she wasn't running anymore. "You stayed," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, Yunia let herself believe in the possibility of staying too. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon, but the tension that hung in the air was thick, and Ransom couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was coming. He stood at the edge of the cabin, watching the road that wound through the dry hills, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Hollins wouldn't stay away for long. 2 days to prepare. He had a rifle with a single bullet left, and he had a feeling it wouldn't be enough to stop whatever Hollins was planning. His mind raced through every possible scenario. The law, the men Hollins would bring, the way he would twist the truth until it bent in his favor. He couldn't let Unia go. He couldn't. She had saved his daughter's life, given them hope when he had none, and now he would do whatever it took to protect her. He wasn't the man he had been a week ago, and he wasn't going to let this man, this coward, take away the only good thing he had left. Inside the cabin, Unia was packing a small bag, her movements quick and purposeful. She knew what was coming, too. She had seen the fear in Ransom's eyes, felt the weight of the decision she knew he would have to make. She wanted to protect him, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. She was part of this now, and she had to face it head on. She was tired of running. The letter from Ruth that she had been holding onto for so long. It had been her only proof of legitimacy, the only thing that tied her to her past life. And now, it was the only weapon they had against Hollins. She had always been Ruth's apprentice, but the law didn't care about that. Ruth had never made a will, and Hollins had long since claimed everything as his own. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Unia asked, her voice breaking through Ransom's thoughts. He turned to look at her, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he replied, his eyes scanning the room. "But we'll make enough. We have to." He couldn't afford to think of what would happen if it didn't work. The only thing that mattered now was keeping her here, keeping Fiza safe, keeping what they had built together intact. Ransom reached for the rifle again, his fingers brushing against the cold steel. The one bullet. He checked the chamber, but there was nothing left to do except wait. Wait for Hollins and his men to come barreling down the road, looking to take what they thought was rightfully theirs. Fiza sat on the porch, her legs swinging back and forth as she hummed softly to herself. She didn't understand what was happening. Not really. She had only seen the men in the distance, the ones who had threatened Unia, and her heart was still full of innocence. Her daddy had always been strong, and she thought that nothing could hurt them anymore. But as the sun climbed higher, Ransom couldn't help but feel that his daughter's world was about to shift in a way that would leave it irreparably broken. The quiet before the storm lasted for what felt like an eternity. Ransom could see it in Unia's face. She was preparing for what might come, even though she didn't know if it would be enough. They both knew the law was coming, but how would it be decided? Was it enough to stand up to Hollins, a man who would stop at nothing to have what he wanted? Would the letter Ruth left be enough to prove Unia's right to the things Hollins claimed as his own? As the day wore on, their quiet conversation turned into preparations. They both knew Hollins would return with the law and with a vengeance. There were no guarantees, but the thought of standing idly by was unbearable. Ransom wasn't the type to run, not anymore. As night began to fall, the sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Ransom's pulse quickened, and Unia moved to his side, her hand reaching out instinctively, her fingers brushing his. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll do this together," he said, his voice steady. It was all they could do. As the horses drew nearer, Ransom's grip tightened around his rifle, his heart thudding in his chest. The law had arrived. Deputy Marshal Teague rode ahead, a weathered, experienced man who had seen enough to know when something didn't sit right. Behind him were Hollins and his hired men, looking smug and confident, ready to take what they thought was theirs. Fiza, still sitting on the porch, was quiet now, sensing the change in the air. Her innocent question earlier about the mean man had only been the start. She was beginning to understand, slowly, that something wasn't right. "This is it," Ransom muttered under his breath, his hand still on the rifle. Unia gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving the men as they approached. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no going back. Ransom, Unia, T greeted, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. He was a man of few words, and he had heard enough about Hollins to know that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. Hollins wasted no time. "She's stolen property," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Those medicines, that horse, those belong to me. She's been taking what's mine for far too long." Ransom stepped forward, his body tense, but his voice strong. "She didn't steal anything," he said firmly. "Ruth left those things to her. She's the apprentice." Holland scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Without proof, that's just a lie." But Unia, standing beside Ransom, was ready. She pulled out the letter Ruth had written, the one that had once been just a piece of paper in a forgotten bag, but now it was her lifeline. "Ruth's own words," she said, her voice clear. "She named me her apprentice. Those tools are mine by right." Teague took the letter, his eyes scanning it carefully. There was no question that it was Ruth's handwriting. He knew Ruth, had worked with her years ago. His gaze shifted to Hollins, and the truth slowly started to emerge. Hollins' calm demeanor began to falter, his arrogance giving way to desperation. He had nothing to stand on. "That's Ruth's handwriting," Teague said, his voice low, and then he turned to Hollins. "This isn't about property. It's about you trying to force her into something she never agreed to." The realization hit like a hammer. Hollins had been trying to claim Unia, and this wasn't about the medicines or the horse. It was about his control over her. Teague's voice was firm now. "You'll leave, and you'll stay away. You got no claim here." Hollins, unable to argue, seethed but could do nothing. He turned his horse without another word, his men following, defeated. Teague tipped his hat to Ransom and Unia. "You've got yourself a good one," he said gruffly to Ransom. "And you, ma'am, you've got yourself a good man." The riders left, and the dust settled. The storm had passed for now, but the weight of the moment still hung in the air. As the sun set, Ransom turned to Unia, his heart full. "You're safe now," he said, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the truth. But even as they breathed a collective sigh of relief, Unia's voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" she whispered. The answer was simple, yet so much more complicated. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would stay. 2 weeks had passed since Hollins and his men had ridden away, and in those 2 weeks, the homestead had transformed. The garden that had once been a patch of dry, cracked earth now showed signs of life. Lush green shoots pushing through the soil, a small but hopeful patch of hope. The cabin was no longer the bleak, hollow place it had once been. Unia had helped organize the interior, turning the space from a mere shelter into something that felt like a home. Fiza was stronger now, laughing more, running outside to play in the dirt with the chickens, picking wildflowers to decorate the cabin. And through it all, Ransom and Unia had settled into a quiet rhythm, their lives intertwined in ways neither had expected. They worked together in a way that felt natural, as though they had always belonged here, on this piece of land, with this strange but tender family they had become. Ransom found himself looking at Unia in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before, his gaze lingering a little too long when she smiled, when she worked alongside him. He noticed the way she cared for Fiza as if the child were her own, the way her touch was gentle yet firm, the way she had a knack for making everything better, even when things seemed impossible. She was teaching him things, how to care for copper, how to mend fences, how to grow vegetables from soil that had once been barren. But it wasn't just practical lessons. It was the way she taught him how to hope again, how to see a future where he had none. And every day, he found himself drawn to her more and more, until it was impossible to deny what was growing inside him. But he couldn't let himself go there, not yet. He had told himself when Sarah died that he would never open his heart to anyone again, not after losing her. He had promised himself that Fiza would be enough, that he wouldn't risk the kind of pain that came with love. But Unia was something different. She was not like Sarah, and he was not Sarah's widower anymore. He was Ransom, standing here in this small, broken-down cabin with a woman who had saved his daughter's life, a woman who made him feel alive again, even when everything had seemed dead. As the days passed, their connection deepened, though neither spoke of it directly. It hung between them in the stolen glances, the small gestures of care, the shared moments of silence when they simply existed together. But then, one evening, as Fiza sat beside the fire with her books, asking about bedtime stories and the wonders of the world, she asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Daddy, are you going to marry Unia?" she asked, her wide, innocent eyes fixed on him. The words stopped Ransom in his tracks, and his heart skipped a beat. He looked at Unia, his throat tightening. She was just sitting there, her hands folded in her lap, not looking at him, but he could feel her tension. They had never spoken about this, what they were becoming. She had never given him any reason to think she expected anything more than what they had. But the question hung in the air like a challenge, as if it demanded an answer. Ransom choked on his food, fumbling with the spoon in his hand. He hadn't expected Fiza to ask, hadn't expected her to see what was happening between him and Unia. But somehow, in the innocence of her voice, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Fiza, that's not," he began, but the words died in his throat. "Don't you love her?" "I do," Fiza said, her tone matter-of-fact, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ransom's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Unia again. This time, she met his gaze, her face flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. The unspoken tension between them was palpable, a heaviness that neither had been willing to acknowledge until now. "Yes," Ransom said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do love her." Unia's breath hitched, her eyes wide, as if the words had caught her off guard. But then, after a long silence, she gave a small, uncertain nod. "But marriage is something people decide together, sweetheart," he said, his voice steadying, though his chest felt tight. The conversation was over for now, but the weight of it lingered. He knew what Fiza had seen, and he knew what she had asked. She wanted them to be a family, in the simplest, purest way that a child could. And somewhere deep inside, Ransom wanted that too. He just didn't know how to get there. That night, after Fiza had fallen asleep, Ransom and Unia sat together on the porch, the stars stretching out above them like a vast, uncharted map. It was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of copper grazing in the field. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ransom's mind was full of the words Fiza had said, the weight of them pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say, or even what he was feeling. But he knew one thing. Unia had become a part of his world in ways he couldn't explain. She had filled the emptiness that had haunted him since Sarah died, and now, with her beside him, he realized how much he had been missing. Finally, Unia broke the silence. "Ransom," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Did you mean that? When you said you loved me?" His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and the answer came clear and undeniable. "Yes," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "I meant every word." Her eyes softened, a small, hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know how to be someone's wife," she said, her voice breaking a little, as if the words had been waiting to escape for a long time. Ransom reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You're already a mother to my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're already the reason we survive. Paper wouldn't change much." She blinked, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. "It would change everything for me," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "Then don't think of it as marriage. Think of it as choosing to stay. Every day, until maybe one day you want it permanent." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps for truth, perhaps for the same hope she saw in his eyes. "You'd wait for me?" she asked softly. He smiled, the answer clear in his heart. "Long as you need." She nodded slowly, her breath shaky. "What if that's forever?" she whispered. "Then I'll spend forever grateful you're here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The moment hung between them, a fragile promise built on trust and something deeper, something neither of them could name yet. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it was theirs to shape. "I'm scared," Unia confessed, her voice small. "Not of him, of this, of feeling safe, because now I have something to lose." Ransom understood. "When Sarah died, I swore never again. Then Fiza gave me no choice." She looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "And now?" she asked softly. "Neither do you," he replied. And with that, something shifted between them, something that was both a promise and a surrender. They weren't running anymore. They were choosing to stay, together. The wedding day arrived, a quiet affair, as simple as the life they had built in these few months together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the cabin, the earth around it now teeming with life. Ransom stood by the porch, his hands nervously adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined this moment. The idea of remarrying, of welcoming someone else into his heart, had seemed impossible after Sarah's death. But now, as the time drew near, it felt right. Unia, the woman who had walked into his life as a stranger and had changed everything, was about to become his wife. Fiza, radiant in her little wildflower crown, bounced around excitedly, her energy infectious. She had already started referring to Unia as Mama Unia, a title that had come naturally, and neither Ransom nor Unia could bring themselves to correct it. The wedding wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate promises. It was about the quiet, everyday moments that had built the foundation of their lives together. Deputy Teague, who had become a friend in the weeks since the confrontation with Hollins, stood at the front, ready to officiate the ceremony. The townspeople, those whom Unia had helped over the past few weeks, were scattered around the porch and yard, some sitting on the few chairs they had borrowed, others standing in the soft grass. There were no lavish decorations, no expensive dresses, just a small gathering of people who cared about them, people who had seen the kindness in Unia and the strength in Ransom. They were there to witness this moment, this promise that had blossomed from hardship and uncertainty. Unia wore a simple blue dress she had borrowed from a woman in town, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, the same quiet grace about her that had drawn Ransom to her from start. She was beautiful, but not in the way that made her stand out from the rest of the world. She was beautiful because of the quiet strength that emanated from her, the way she had stepped into their lives and made everything feel whole again. As they stood before Deputy Teague, Ransom's heart raced. Fiza stood between them, clutching Unia's hand as the ceremony began. There were no elaborate vows, no promises of grandeur, only the simplicity of their truth, the sincerity of their intentions. When it was Ransom's turn to speak, he looked into Unia's eyes, and the words seemed to come naturally, as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. "I vow to protect you, to provide for you, and to never let you doubt that you are wanted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I vow to make this life, this home, a place worth staying for as long as we both live." Unia's voice trembled as she spoke, her gaze never leaving his. "I vow to heal you, to hold you, and to make this cabin a home worth staying for," she said, her words soft but resolute. "I vow to give Fiza the family she deserves." The vows were simple, but they were enough. The connection between them, the trust that had slowly grown in the wake of their shared hardships, was more powerful than any grand declaration. It wasn't about promises that were easy to make. It was about the choice to stay, to commit to something deeper. "Who gives this bride?" Deputy Teague asked, his voice gruff, but a smile tugging at his lips. Fiza's small voice rang out, clear and certain. I do. I give her to Daddy, and Daddy give himself to her, and we're all together. The room erupted in laughter, and for the first time in so long, Ransom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His daughter, his little bird, had just made the most important promise of all. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by love, by choice. The kiss that followed was tentative at first, as if both of them were unsure how to take this final step into something they had only dreamed of. But then it deepened, and in that moment, the world outside faded. There was no past, no pain, just the promise of the future they would build together. After the ceremony, the celebration was modest. Fiddle music drifted through the warm evening air as the small crowd danced, the sounds of joy mixing with the laughter of friends. Fiza twirled around the yard, her little feet kicking up dust as she moved to the rhythm of the music, her happiness a testament to everything they had been through. Ransom found himself caught up in the moment, lifting Fiza in his arms for the first dance, the bond between father and daughter stronger than ever. When he set her down, he turned to Unia, his heart swelling as he reached for her hand. I don't know how to dance, he said with a half smile. Unia grinned, the corners of her eyes crinkling. Neither do I, she said, her voice light. But we'll figure it out together. And that was what they had always done, figured things out together. The evening passed in a blur of music, dancing, and shared moments. And as the guests slowly drifted away, the three of them found themselves alone again, just as they had been so many times before. Fiza was tucked into bed, her face peaceful in sleep, her wildflower crown resting beside her. Ransom and Unia sat on the porch, the stars now bright above them, the night air cool but comforting. There was no need for words between them. The silence was enough. The next chapter of their lives was just beginning, but it felt like they had already lived it 1,000 times. The uncertainty of the past was gone, replaced by the simple truth of their bond. Unia's voice broke the quiet, soft and hesitant. I don't know how to, she began, but Ransom placed a gentle finger on her lips, silencing her words. We don't have to. Not yet, he whispered. She looked at him, and in that moment, something deep within her shifted. But you're my husband now, she said, her voice barely audible. And I'm choosing you, he replied, his hand resting over hers. There was no rush. Not anymore. Everything they'd gone through, every step, every trial, had brought them to this moment. And as they sat together, the promise of a new beginning hung in the air between them, a quiet certainty that this was where they were meant to be. The world had been hard on them, but now, in each other's arms, they had found a reason to keep going, to keep loving, and to keep choosing each other every single day. As the night deepened and the stars above twinkled in the vast sky, they knew that no matter what the future held, they were ready. They had made it this far, and together, they would face whatever came next.